A mother walks to her neighbor's door, collapses in the driveway, and whispers 4 words, "I shot my kids." But when police arrive, she asks only one question, and it's not what you'd expect. Shepherdsville, Kentucky rests quietly just south of Louisville, a community where neighbors know each other, and violent crime rarely touches their streets. The morning of November 8th, 2023 began like any other in this small town. Children prepared for school, parents started their daily routines. But inside one home on Bentwood Drive, something had already gone terribly wrong. Tiffany Lucas, a 32-year-old mother of 2, had been showing troubling signs for weeks. Friends and family noticed changes they couldn't explain. Her behavior grew erratic, her thoughts seemed scattered. On this particular morning, the fragile balance she had been maintaining finally collapsed. Her 6-year-old son, Jaden, and 9-year-old son, Maurice, were inside that house. What happened next would shock this peaceful community to its core and leave 2 young boys fighting for their lives. The events that unfolded would challenge everything this town believed about safety, motherhood, and the hidden struggles people carry behind closed doors. The first sign of trouble came when a neighbor spotted Tiffany Lucas collapsed in her driveway. She had stumbled over from her house, barely conscious, unable to stand or speak clearly. The neighbor rushed to help, not knowing the horror that awaited inside Tiffany's home. She called 911 immediately, reporting that her neighbor had passed out and she couldn't wake her. As she spoke with the dispatcher, Tiffany began screaming something that made the neighbor's blood run cold. She was crying out that her children were dying. The neighbor didn't even know Tiffany's name at that moment. She had no idea what had happened in that house. All she knew was that a mother was on her driveway, fading in and out of consciousness, and her boys were in grave danger. The dispatcher stayed on the line, trying to gather information while emergency services raced toward Bentwood Drive. A second neighbor crossed the lawn to investigate what was happening inside the house. What he found would haunt him forever. He discovered 2 young boys on a bed covered in blood. He called 911 immediately, his voice shaking with panic. He reported that there was a child on the bed, covered in blood, and a gun was present. He told the dispatcher there were 2 children, both breathing but unresponsive. He described a scene of unimaginable chaos. There was blood everywhere, and the boys looked small, too small to be facing such violence. He stayed on the phone, trying to help the children while waiting for paramedics. He checked for wounds and found that the older boy had been shot through the shoulder. The neighbor's frantic call captured the terror of that morning and the desperate race against time to save 2 young lives. Officers arrived to find Tiffany Lucas in the neighbor's driveway, handcuffed and barely conscious. She had apparently confessed to the neighbor that she shot her children before collapsing. The responding officers noted her inability to stand and her faint, disjointed speech. They treated her with care, changing out her handcuffs and trying to get her upright. When asked why she was in custody, another officer explained that she had admitted to shooting her kids. The only question Tiffany asked was whether her children were still alive. She showed no concern about what had happened or how they were doing. She simply wanted to know if they had survived. The officers exchanged glances, understanding the gravity of the situation. Inside that house, 2 young boys were fighting for their lives. The evidence would soon confirm what they already suspected. Paramedics rushed into the bedroom and found a scene of devastation. Both boys had been shot in the head. 6-year-old Jaden and 9-year-old Maurice lay on the bed, covered in blood. The paramedics worked frantically to save them, pumping one child's chest while the other struggled to breathe. The dispatcher relayed critical information to the hospital. One child had regained a pulse. They needed a police escort to get there as quickly as possible. Every second counted. The medical team fought with everything they had, refusing to give up on these 2 young boys. Detectives entered the crime scene and began documenting the evidence. 4 shell casings were found on the bed and the floor. The shooter had fired at least 4 times. The gun was still there, lying next to the children who had been shot with it. By midday, Tiffany Lucas was transported to the sheriff's office for questioning. Her behavior during the drive and initial processing raised immediate concerns. She claimed to have shot herself in the ear, but officers found no wound. She talked about people preying on children and made statements that made no sense. The officers recognized that something was deeply wrong with her mental state. They placed her in an interrogation room and began the difficult process of trying to understand what had happened. Tiffany agreed to speak with detectives, but her answers were confusing and contradictory. She insisted she loved her children and would never hurt them. When asked about the shooting, she blamed outside forces. She claimed video games and YouTube had manipulated her children's minds. The detectives listened carefully, trying to separate truth from delusion. Tiffany's interrogation became increasingly bizarre as she introduced a man named Parker Borders. She claimed he had been manipulating her mind for 3 years through her phone and Wi-Fi. She described him as a sugar daddy figure who controlled her bills and had access to her home. She insisted he had manipulated her into hurting her children. She said the gun belonged to him. When detectives pressed for details, her story shifted and changed. She could not explain how her sons were shot if she hadn't done it. She admitted she pulled the trigger, but immediately denied responsibility. She blamed Parker Borders for everything. Detectives investigated this claim and found that a man by that name existed in nearby Bardstown, but no evidence connected him to this case. There were no police reports, no court records, no proof that Parker Borders had anything to do with this tragedy. The interrogation continued for hours, with detectives trying to get a straight answer from Tiffany. She circled back to the same themes repeatedly. She loved her children. She was a good mother. Someone had manipulated her. Someone else was responsible. She prayed aloud, reciting the Lord's Prayer, to wall herself off from the questions. Then she asked where her children were. The detectives told her the boys were in critical condition, but still alive. That was the last meaningful exchange of the interview. Tiffany would not admit what she had done. She would not explain why she pulled the trigger. She remained trapped in a reality where she was the victim, not the perpetrator. The detectives ended the session knowing they had enough evidence to charge her with murder. The case would go forward, but the question of why would remain unanswered. Later that day, both of Tiffany's sons died from their injuries at the hospital. 6-year-old Jaden and 9-year-old Morris were gone. The community gathered to mourn 2 young lives cut short. Tiffany was formally charged with 2 counts of murder and held on $2 million bond. Her attorneys signaled they would pursue an insanity defense. Nearly a year passed before she appeared in court again. When she did, she abandoned that defense and entered an open guilty plea with no deal or leniency. Her fate rested entirely with the judge. In November 2024, the courtroom filled with grieving family members. Jaden's grandmother delivered a heart-wrenching statement, describing how Tiffany had ripped their lives apart. She demanded justice for the 2 boys who would never grow up, never celebrate another birthday, never have the future they deserved. Judge Rodney Burris handed down the maximum sentence for both counts of murder. Tiffany Lucas received 2 life sentences to be served consecutively. The family felt relief, but also frustration. In Kentucky, life sentences allow for parole consideration after 20 years. For the grandmother and other relatives, this felt insufficient. They believed Tiffany should suffer as they suffered. The community still carries the weight of that November morning. The children's names are remembered. Their brief lives are honored. Tiffany Lucas will spend decades in prison, but that cannot bring back Jaden and Morris. It cannot undo the morning of November 8, 2023. It cannot erase the screams heard by neighbors or the blood found on the bed. The story stands as a painful reminder of what happens when mental illness goes untreated and when the people meant to protect us become the ones we fear most.